If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Just let me explain. First, it's free. Second, there are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Plus, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more places. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. All you have to do to get started is download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Common Pawpaw. I took Tristan to Pine Bluff today, the city where I spent most of my childhood. We rolled into the Bluff when I was 4, or the verge of the Bluff since my 23-year-old mother was trying to skirt past the city on our way to California. But her old car broke down and the only people she knew in Arkansas was my dad's mother and stepfather, Mamaw and Pawpaw. She called Pawpaw and told him we were stranded on the side of the road. He drove out to pick us up, piled us into the back of a giant Buick and dropped us off in the front half of a duplex he owned, a place I remember as home for most of the first decade of my life. My mom always talked about California like it was some sort of golden land of opportunity, but I wondered why Arkansas wasn't also? After all, the plates on the cars called the state the land of opportunity. The duplex was tiny, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. It didn't have air conditioning for the first couple of years, then Pawpaw put in a window unit. There was an old Formica table in the kitchen, a giant oversized space heater in the living area and 2 tiny bedrooms that maybe measured 10 by 10. My brother and I shared 1 bedroom in the back while my mom had the front bedroom. I remember on Saturday mornings we would get up to watch cartoons and eat cereal, and at 10 o'clock when Soul Train or American Bandstand came on, my mom would escort us out either the front or side door, lock the screen, and we were on our own until dark. In winter we wore coats and sometimes tube socks as gloves. In summer we wore shorts and little else. We played with the neighbors who had 2 little girls, one my age, and one a year younger than my brother. We climbed trees and rode bikes and played in a shed that her father had bought as a playhouse for her. The house was only 2 blocks from my grandparents, so their home became like ours and is a central part of my memories growing up. My mom, always in search of something, moved us away almost every other year. We tried Birmingham, and Atlanta, and Warren R., always spending a school year in someplace new and then coming back to Pine Bluff. Maybe there were better opportunities in those places, or maybe she fought with my pawpaw on how to raise the boys. It was tough for an uneducated single mother going through a string of men in the 70s, each with some weird peccadillo. They were all drug users. My mom was an alcoholic and cigarette addict who smoked at least 2 marijuana joints a day. The kinds of people she brought through the door on a consistent basis define the words white trash. That's the basis of my opinion about marijuana. If it's so good, why do so many losers use it? I associate the drug use with it. Some of her boyfriends beat us, some tried to molest us, some ignored us and tried to get her to pawn us off onto my grandparents. And my mom, so young and desperate to be loved, uneducated and mostly scared, opened her heart and our doors to a lot of people. She couldn't qualify for a job that paid much. She had a high school degree but consigned herself to secretarial and office work and didn't try to improve her lot in life. She worked as a bartender, for a while my brother and I were watched by a black family, who called us their other kids. The bartender job paid cash, which allowed her to get out from the duplex, and we moved into a trailer on the south side of town. She had a velvet painting of a señorita on one wall, whose eyes watched you as you walked across the room. One Saturday, I was left to watch my brother. I couldn't have been 4 or 5, and he 2 or 3. He was hungry. So I poured the last of the cereal into a bowl, but we didn't have milk. I used water on the frosted flakes and we shared the bowl. After an hour or so, he was hungry again. All we had were eggs. I carefully cracked 2 into a bowl and whisked them with a fork. I got the pan out of the cabinet and put it on the stove. Then I needed to light the burner. I wasn't allowed to use matches, so I rolled up a piece of paper, just as I had seen her do, and lit the paper. I turned the front burner on and moved the paper to it, and it lit with a whoosh. Flames spread up the paper and singed my finger. I dropped the paper onto the linoleum floor and it caught fire. The plastic linoleum burned fast. Like it was made from solidified gasoline. I jumped off the chair I had been using as a stool and got water from the sink. I poured it on the floor and put out the fire, But now there was a big patch of ruined linoleum. We avoided disaster, but I knew I was going to get a spanking when Mom got home from wherever she was. And my brother was still hungry. So I scrambled the eggs and fed him. I cleaned up the water off the floor. And when Mom got home, I got my ass beat. I know now it was because she was afraid of what might have happened. Perhaps she was even mad that she had been at work, or out with friends while we were home with so little. I can't even say she tried. Maybe in kindness I could say she tried her best. But food was never a priority in the house. The shopping list ran cigarettes, beer, weed, bills, then food. In that order. I can't fathom not putting kids first now that I'm a father, but I see it still when I go to the store, or see other people. It must be a white trash or poor people mentality. Beer, cigarettes and whatever's left used for life. It doesn't make sense to me. My father was the same way. We moved back into the duplex shortly after the fire incident. As an adult, I realized that the proximity to my grandparents allowed them to check on us when we were left alone. That proximity was also the reason my mom constantly ran away. Pawpaw didn't approve of her lifestyle or choices and was constantly trying to help her, with conditions. And like I said, Mom was not very good in making good choices. That's my old high school, I told Tristan. She wanted to know more about me, where I came from and my side of the family. She didn't feel connected to them, and why would she? We moved to Florida when she was only 3 years old, and my father made it clear he didn't approve of her mom. It was easier to cut ties and close that chapter in my life than deal with the constant little digs and reminders that he didn't like Tristan's mom. For some reason, people feel like they're stuck with family and they have to put up with the abuse they heap or the way they treat them. People will cut out bad friends, they will cut out bad habits, but they will cling to family members that weigh them down like anchors, all for the simple title of family. My mother and stepfather placed their addictions over the needs of their children. My father did the same. As an adult, I came to learn these things, and as a father I came to wonder about the reasons behind them. And my decision was to eliminate that from my life. I can see it replaying though, as just another version of my father's life. I hardly knew my grandfather, my dad's dad, who had another family in Jackson, Mississippi, and I didn't feel a loss for it. I had Pawpaw and Mama as a constant in my life, rocks to cling to when the waters of Mom's stormy relationships threatened to drown us, or once I was a teen and moved in with my dad, his constant absences. I mentioned my mom's poor choices, but don't think she was alone in making them. My father was only 21 when I was born, barely more than a hippie child himself. What could he possibly know about being a dad? Especially when he was consumed with being a rock and roll star, or poet, something other than staying home and taking care of the children. Except that as I grew older and learned, he didn't really have a problem taking care of children, just his own. When I was 14, I moved in with my dad. He traveled every other week to Oklahoma or Louisiana or Mississippi to work on an oil rig. 7 on, 7 off they called it. He did this for years until I was 15. We always seemed to struggle for money. There was just enough for beer and cigarettes for the adults, and chili and lasagna and bologna for the kids. My stepmom would make a big pot of chili on Sundays and we would eat off it for a couple of days, then a lasagna on Wednesday, which would carry us to Friday. Friday or Saturday she would make homemade pizza with a biscuit crust. But the priority was the same. Cigarettes first, 2 cartons. Beer next, 1 case. Then bills. Then food. At 16 we learned Dad had another family out of state. A young mom and her 2 children, neither his. He was supporting them too. So it turns out the priority was cigs, beer, other family, bills, then food. My stepmother left him and moved back to her home state. Her daughter moved in with friends so she could graduate from high school in Pine Bluff. I'm not sure how my dad reacted. His attitude was always stoic to me, a feigned toughness. I'm not even sure he felt guilty about it, but perhaps just bad that he was caught. Then the oil industry took a header and he was out of job. My junior and senior year of high school was my dad looking for work, working in a factory or working at a gas station. He did make an effort to go back to school and learn electronics, and he graduated from trade school at the same time I graduated from high school. He and my brother moved to Texas after I graduated to start a new job at Texas Instruments. When I came to visit later, it turns out my brother was raising himself, working at Applebee's and going to high school, while Dad was settling into his new job, and supporting a new single mom he had started dating. Order was established, at least the order of cigs, beer, new family, bills and food. My brother could pay for his own. Rich's Hamburgers was crowded. I wanted to take Tristan there, but she was hungry now and we missed beating the lunch rush by 30 minutes. Cars were stacked and there were 2 lines 10 people deep. We got caught up in a detour downtown. A year ago a building collapsed on Main Street downtown, and the city shut off a couple of blocks while they determined the structural integrity of buildings around it. Turns out, not only is Pine Bluff dying, the Main Street is rotting at the core. The politicians came out in force against the state of Main Street, but a year later, not much is being done. I've read reports of buildings changing hands, and one building owner who keeps pushing back inspection dates and meetings with the city council. Simmons Bank rode to the rescue with a $10 million fund, but the big question is, why? Why are they trying to save the Main Street of a dead downtown? Business won't move there, and people won't go. Pine Bluff is rife with examples of poor business ownership, and I think a lot has to do with my parents' generation. I compare them to my pawpaw's generation and my own. Pawpaw was a carpenter. He built things. When the Pine Bluff Arsenal was being built, the government needed houses moved or torn down on the property. My grandfather heard about it, bought 6 houses for $10 each, plus moving cost. He then bought land out in the country south of Pine Bluff, and 2 lots he owned in town. He drove out to the arsenal, jacked up each house onto a trailer, and moved them through town. 3 went to the land in the country, 3 went to the lots in the city. He used his carpentry skills to fix up the houses, and then rented them out. Pawpaw was a deacon in his church, which he and other parishioners built on their own. The church was located 4 blocks from the house where he lived, which he and his dad built in the late 60s. As I think back, Pawpaw owned 8 houses plus 20 acres. He was constantly building in Pine Bluff. He knew carpentry, plumbing, welding, electrical work and grading, and he knew the movers and shakers who built and expanded the town. My dad and mom's generation did not. They built businesses that were unsustainable and refused to evolve with the town. As I grew older and see how much politics comes into play in small towns like Pine Bluff, I can also see how the boomer generation there refused to learn basics, and subsequently made a series of failures that led to a cascade of defections in my generation. The baby boomer-s kids didn't want to stay in Pine Bluff and departed in droves, leading to a decline in almost 15,000 population since 1988. Those left behind haven't built anything in the city, rather they've moved it further south along Highway 15, and Highway 79 toward Watson Chapel or further north into Whitehall, edging closer to Little Rock. When people left, it created a vacuum and Pine Bluff had an abundance of trash to move in and fill the void. There was a house there when I was growing up, it's torn down now. And there. And there. And there. We drove down 32nd Avenue past my grandparents' old place. The house my grandfather built belonged to someone else now, a stranger. The house beside it, where his mother and then sister lived out the last years of their life, was gone, as was his barn and 2 storage sheds along with a lot of history from the property. My aunt, uncle and dad were always complaining about what a pack rat Pawpaw was, and it was true. The barn was stuffed with material and memorabilia, the 2-car garage only had room for Mama's Buick and the storage sheds were stuffed to overflowing with what they all saw as junk. Pawpaw would go to estate sales and auction sites, and make low bids. Sometimes he won, and he would bring it back, pack it tight on a just-in-case I need it basis. Anyone who studied the Great Depression or lived through it knows that mindset. You find uses to fix almost anything. When Pawpaw died, everyone agreed that all of his stuff was garbage, so they rented a dumpster and shoveled everything in from each of the buildings, the garage, barn and his office. It's an example of extremely short-sighted thinking on their part. They used money to pay for a dumpster and hauling, when if they realized what they had, they could have turned his junk into 6 figures or more. At the time of his death, a new store was coming online called Etsy. Vintage and handmade items were listed and sold to collectors. Pawpaw had over 1,000 postcards sent to him by his traveling sisters, and ones he collected as he and my grandmother traveled. He packed them all away and after he died, they were thrown away in mint condition. It was junk to them. I can see now they resented him. He was a harsh man. He was a know-it-all and a story topper, meaning if you did something, he did it better, faster or had seen something more. He hated to loan his equipment because it often came back broke, and the family would argue over the state of the equipment and who was responsible for repair. But if they had expanded their minds beyond beer, cigarettes and just cleaning out the house cause Mama wouldn't be able to, they would have seen so much opportunity it was insane. But they were lifelong residents of Pine Bluff, except for my dad, and as such couldn't think that way. Their generation destroyed the town, just as they destroyed the opportunity to make money from collections my pawpaw held on to. Magazines, political pamphlets, little slices of historical bric-a-brac secreted away in drawers and crannies since the early 60s. Furniture that had been purchased in the 70s, and when gone out of style moved to one of the houses in the country was now back in vogue. Rather than categorize and list on Etsy or eBay, his kids just tossed it in the dumpster. Instead of cleaning up and listing on Craigslist, they just tossed it all away. That was a bad mentality. As if the folks who came before them couldn't understand this new world, and therefore all the rules need to be tossed out. It's as if the principles were ignored, and then my generation absconded from Pine Bluff because our parents made such a mess of it. Better to build our own version of tomorrow somewhere else. Even now I wonder why I was so anxious to get out. I traveled the states and set my sights on far-flung parts of the world. I also married young, made my home in the state capital, and even though I graduated college did my best to avoid the corporate track. I considered law school, I considered sales management, and all the while I wrote books and movies, and short stories and comic books. I never once considered becoming a homegrown film and authorpreneur. Downtown Pine Bluff, in decline since '88, and honestly if you're looking at building occupation, probably since the late '70s, was a ripe plum for plucking up old buildings for a song. I never asked Pawpaw what he thought of buying a building or a block downtown. I wondered what advice he would have offered. 40-year-old me considers urban redevelopment a priority, though looking at Little Rock they're not doing it any better than Pine Bluff. Main Street in LR is so slow to develop because a bunch of Dallas immigrants bought up abandoned property, jacked up the prices and waited. Now buildings are so expensive to buy and rehabilitate into new property, it takes a consortium of investors to pull it off. Then they jack up the rent so high, small businesses can't cover the overhead on the meager foot traffic that Main Street generates. It becomes a revolving door of new experiments, where wannabe business owners try to open up their restaurant in the same spot where 3 others failed. There are success stories, and those are the ones people pin their hopes on, but one cafe on a corner of the block with limited hours and mostly serving the business lunch crowd does not a mogul make. It's like hunting for gems at the crater of Diamond State Park when looking for what works. It takes a lot of digging, and there might be more to the story than just the $15 cheeseburger on the menu. At least Little Rock can rely on the convention traffic and annual visitors to keep the businesses in the River Market District afloat. And LR has done some wonders between the Clinton Library and the Broadway Bridge. The splash pad is a popular summer attraction, and turning 2 of the old railroad bridges into pedestrian paths linking North Little Rock and Little Rock as arteries of the river trail was genius. Little Rock has something to offer as the state capital of Arkansas, and even if there is still so much work to be done, my generation and my children are left to wonder still, is Pine Bluff worth saving? Pawpaw may have suggested buying up a block at a time in downtown PB. He may have said rent out the bottom to a coffee shop or Starbucks knockoff, and turn the top 2 floors into loft apartments. He would have suggested that with the completion of the 530 corridor that turned Old 65 into an expressway to Little Rock, PB could have set itself up as a bedroom community, much as Conway and Mayflower did. They're the same distance and they're both close to the R River, both attributes shared by Pine Bluff. Can you imagine driving into PB from LR, turning off at the gold-domed courthouse and parking because Main Street is now a pedestrian walkway? Art galleries and small cafes line the street, a photographer's studio, and museums, with residents who call the upper floors home populating the area for the first 4 blocks to the train tracks that cut through the middle of town. The entire downtown area is served by free Wi-Fi towers hidden discreetly on top of the buildings, nestled among the solar panels and beehives that pollinate the rooftop flower gardens and the window boxes on every building. A street band plays, street performers show up on weekends to wow the small crowds that gather for a farmer's market in the parking lot outside of the courthouse. When Tristan and I were driving around, ideas popped out on almost every corner, and with the assistance of UAPB and the Pine Bluff High School, the mayor and city council have a real opportunity to make a difference. Unfortunately, there's too much infighting and bickering among the generation of politicians that has to this point failed the city, and will continue to do so in the foreseeable future. Even the announcement of a new billion-dollar plant moving into the south of town is tempered by the reality that PB is just one location in the possible running. That announcement translated means that maybe the company might pick Pine Bluff. But if those business leaders hit Main Street today, do you seriously think they would pick the city? Main Street on Monday was still blocked after a year of deciding who was responsible for the building that fell into the street. Was it the building owner? Was it the city? Piles of bricks shut off one of the forgotten main corridors of the dying town while the city tries to decide who should clean up the mess. A leader would have sent trucks and workers to clean up the bricks, haul them to an empty lot at least, and bill the building owner. The problem is downtown Pine Bluff building owners are absent and allowing the buildings to fall into decay and disrepair. I told Tristan about eminent domain and an 11-year-old child gets it. When the city finds abandoned and derelict property in residential areas, they can order the property torn down because it's a nuisance and danger and bill the owner of record for the service. Why doesn't a leader in PB do the same? This creates a vacant lot problem, and a number of studies have shown that vacant lots lead to an increase in crime and decrease in property value, but again, a real leader would see this as an opportunity instead of a problem. In 6 months' time, a real leader could make serious inroads in repairing PB and its image. 1. Establish a timeline with a move it or lose it deadline. A. Create an immediate list of all property owners who owe back taxes in the city on residential and commercial property. B. Create and send an immediate payment due certified letter to the business owners with a 14-day response window. C. Track response rate. Property owners who contact the tax office can make payment arrangements, or sell the property to the city for back taxes owed. This relieves the property owner of the financial burden of maintaining the property. D. Property owners who do not respond in 14 days get a certified intent to sell letter. The city will sell the property for the cost of back taxes. E. The tax office lists each property for sale for the tax cost. The real estate contract stipulates that the property must be built upon within 60 days. Failure to live up to the terms of the contract reverts ownership back to the city with all monies forfeited. But what will the new owners build on their new property? And why would they want to build in PB? The death of the middle class across America and the decline of affordable housing options for new homeowners that is plaguing the rest of the country doesn't need to apply in Pine Bluff. Tristan asked, "What's the crime like in Pine Bluff, Dad? Now or when I was growing up?" "Now? It's pretty bad," I told her. "How do you explain to an 11-year-old that the small town you grew up in was not only dying, but making top 10 lists of the most dangerous places to live in America?" It wasn't always so. In the 70s, Pine Bluff had its share of crime and criminal activity. I should know, my mom and stepdad were a part of it. At one point in 1980 to 1983 they were two of the biggest pot dealers in southern Arkansas. People would drop into the house, stay for an hour, smoke a joint with them, and buy a dime bag before leaving. There was a steady procession of people just showing up. They bought their weed in bulk from some guy with a beard who grew it on land out by the Arkansas River, who would show up with a black garbage bag full of dried plants that my mom and stepdad would break down into smaller bags. They weren't criminal masterminds by any means, so the extra money they earned selling weed just allowed them to upgrade the type of beer they bought. We didn't have a nice car, or a nice house, or new clothes, or great Christmas presents. So I can only surmise that they were about as good at being criminals as they were at being parents. The weed business went away in 1983. My mom had lost an office job and moved on to work as a waitress/bartender at a very small cafe on Blake Street in Pine Bluff, just in view of the swinging girl on the Sunbeam sign. My stepdad was a very jealous man, insecure in so many ways that they are legion to list. But he could drink for free, so when he got off second shift from the factory where he worked, he would drive to wait with my mom and give her a ride home. He waited at the bar and drank free beer, and it's anyone's guess as to who drove home. My brother and I, 12 and 10 at the time, were left to watch my two younger half-siblings, 3 and 1, while they both worked from 3 o'clock to 11 o'clock. On one particular evening they came home fighting. The stepdad was mad that some guy was flirting with my mom, they were both drunk and high, and let words fly. He slammed the front door and busted out the window, then grabbed mom and threw her into the wall. I jumped in his face, shoved him, and he shoved me back. Mom grabbed his arm to jerk him away from me. He slapped her. I balled up my fist and punched him. He knocked me down, sat on my chest and pinned my arms with his legs, and used both hands to beat my face. Punch after punch crunched my nose, bruised my cheek, hit my eye. After a moment, he realized what he was doing and started crying. He lurched up off of me, stumbled down the hall to their bedroom and reached for a loaded shotgun, screaming he was going to kill himself. We should have let him. Instead, Mom yelled at me, yelled at him, and grabbed his legs. He tripped with one hand on the 12 gauge on the rack, jerked it down, and the gun went off. It blew a hole through the wall. The gunshot seemed to sober them up. That shot could have gone through one of the interior walls and hit a kid, Or he could have really sprayed his brains across a window. Or turned it on me, or my mom. He sat on the floor by the end of the bed and sobbed, and my mom wrapped her arms around him to comfort him. I grabbed a towel and wiped the blood and snot off my face, and threw a towel at him. They both had cuts that needed stitches, I had scrapes, bruises and a bloody nose, along with swollen eyes, but no split skin, except for one gash on my head. Mom decided they were going to go to the ER, get stitched up, then come back for me after they had sobered up, since showing up drunk to a hospital with a beat-up kid could get child services involved. She wrapped a rag around his cut, held a bandage to hers, and I opened the busted front door so they could go through. I stared down the barrel of a service revolver. The black hole gaped at eye level and I couldn't breathe. "Freeze," the cop said in a calm voice. Which I had absolutely no problem doing. I wasn't sure I could do anything else. My mom and stepdad were behind me, freezing also. My brothers and sister were crying as they stood in the doorway of the hallway and watched. "Stand back," the cop instructed. They were responding to shots fired, and a beaten kid answered the door with two bleeding adults behind him. He couldn't know what he was walking into, and domestic situations are always the worst kind. I stepped back and he stepped into the living room. My mom and stepdad started telling him a version of the story. It involved falling and tripping and me fighting at school, all lies and all told so easily it's as if they were prepared beforehand. No one was pressing charges, and no one was going to jail, so the cop left after 20 minutes or so. My mom and step went to the hospital, and I calmed the kids down and got them into bed. Maybe there was crime in PB when I was growing up, only I didn't notice it, or it seemed far removed because of the way we lived. We were the criminal element, or a part of it. I didn't tell Tristan any of this. Who tells their 11-year-old kid about the dark side of growing up ghetto? I don't think there was much crime worse than normal in Pine Bluff, I told her. But it was the 70s in a small town. In the 80s it seemed to get worse. And by the time I decided to leave Pine Bluff in 1988, it was worse still. I don't know if statistically it was really that bad at the time. Fistfights in the parking lot at Jefferson Square had turned into gunfights. Going downtown after dark had always been an iffy proposition due to the proximity to bad parts of town, but that was a block-by-block determination. One block was full of working-class families, the next block had bad elements on it. Turns out my family growing up were part of the bad element. In the 80s and early 90s, states like California enacted third strike laws. In essence, these laws were designed to permanently remove habitual criminals from the streets. So if you got caught doing something against the law the first time, you got jail or probation. If you got caught a second time, you were looking at some time in jail. And if you got your third strike, you were in for life. In retrospect, this seems to be legislation written and lobbied for by private prison contractors who were paid by the head of each person incarcerated. But it played right into the fear-mongering of early 90s California, and with the unrest in southern Los Angeles, along with racist cops and drug laws, a lot of gang members quickly found themselves 2 strikes up. An idealist would say all those criminal types had to do was change their bad ways. But a cynic could argue that even as they were incarcerated, they could not be rehabilitated because rehabilitation costs money and eats into the profitability of private contractors. Regardless of how it happened, it created a situation where more experienced criminal elements from California, Illinois and other states moved to Little Rock and Pine Bluff, where they found fertile ground for the drug trade, for gang activity and the attendant crimes that ride along with it. Murder, rape, arson, robbery. A third or fourth tier gang member in LA could show up in Pine Bluff, prey on the infatuation with gang culture that was permeating the airways thanks to NWA, Dr. Dre, and other rappers, and become the top dog in their new locale. When another low-level gangster moved into town, it created friction and started the gang wars. Little Rock got so bad an HBO documentary called Bangin' in the Hood was shot and aired. Pine Bluff got little airplay, but the gang problems were just as prevalent and up through 2015 when it was named one of the top 10 worst cities for murder per capita. Which makes my bad element growing up pale by comparison for what some kids see in PB today. The blame falls squarely on parents, but any child who goes through the public education system learns right from wrong, so after the 2nd, 3rd and 4th grade, it then becomes about choice. There are consequences for making the wrong choice. I've tried to stress this to my kids, and when I look at Pine Bluff, I see the direct result of a series of wrong choices made by the city government and by the residents of the city. A number of psychological studies show that fear of loss is a greater motivator than fear of gain. Therefore, we must put the fear of loss into business owners, residents, and every single city official, starting with the mayor and the impossible city council who has allowed this travesty to occur. They must start making right choices or face the consequences of the wrong ones they make. As I drove through the old neighborhood where Pawpaw built his house in the late 50s, I noticed a lot of houses were torn down, leaving weed lots. Each weed lot was covered in trash. Bags, bottles, plastic, and debris grew among the brambles and long grass. It looked trashy. An immediate action would be to enforce the laws upon the books, but change the punishment. Pine Bluff, and other cities in Arkansas, have a litter law. It's a $500-$1,000 fine for littering. How often is that law enforced? Maybe in gross violations, but I'm suggesting a shift in an entire city's behavior through immediate law enforcement. If you litter, you owe $500-$1,000 fine or 100 hours of community service where the violator is picking up litter and cleaning the weed lots. Each hour should produce 1 bag of garbage. If the PB police took 1 day to enforce that law each month, you would create a workforce putting in hundreds of thousands of hours cleaning up the city. Imagine if you enforced the litter law for cigarette butts. That's littering by definition, but so many smokers are selfish and mentally retarded that they don't consider flicking a butt on the ground as trash. Turn the police loose to enforce the law as it is on the book, and you will soon have bodies enough to clean every nook and cranny of the city. You can argue that speeding is against the law, and though police catch and ticket speeders, that doesn't change the behavior of drivers. You would be correct in that argument. But what does change the behavior of drivers? Some cities have elected to take old police cars and place in discreet locations so that speeders slow down as they see the cop car. We've all had that momentary heart palpitation where we round a corner and there's a cop. We glance down at the speedometer to see how far over we're going, and sigh in relief when they don't pop the lights and drop in behind us. But if enough people spend their Saturdays and Sundays or 3 hours every night after work doing community service, then the fear of loss, in this case time, would begin to modify the behavior. Ask yourself one question: would you text and drive if you knew that getting caught meant losing your license? Would you speed through a school zone if you knew getting caught meant losing your license? It seems like such a harsh punishment, except for the alternative. Texting and driving not only endangers you, it endangers everyone around you, therefore removing your ability to drive reduces the threat to others. The same thing works in a school zone. When you speed through a school zone, you are endangering children of others. Removing your ability to drive keeps others safe. Sure, but people will just drive without a license. And when they are caught driving without a license, they are sentenced to 500 to 1,000 hours of community service. That's 3 months of 8-hour workdays doing labor to make the community better. Or if they have job, it's a year of Saturdays, 62.5 for 500 hours, or nights and weekends. When people think that the consequences of their wrong choices will lead to the sacrifice of their time, they will begin to modify the behavior. The community would benefit from the punishment. People will either give up their time or give up their money, and the fines can be used to fund the supervision of the community service effort. The entire effort can be automated through email and computer systems to track and monitor time, and a master plan for the city can be used to develop a timeline and deliverables. In Pine Bluff, where Main Street has been blocked off for over a year, the police could set up a litter sting on one Saturday and find enough people in that one day to clean and maintain Main Street by the end of the week. The community service could clean up all litter from weed lots by district. They could paint low-income and senior citizen houses. They could clean and maintain the city parks. They could remove and paint over graffiti. They could plant and maintain community gardens growing fresh fruits and vegetables for food deserts. The limit we face on what a workforce can accomplish is the lengths by which most people will go to avoid loss. So long as people are willing to make the wrong choice, a strong leader can do right by the community. "This doesn't look so bad," said Tristan. "Just kind of dirty." We drove past Forest Park Elementary School. It was surrounded by an 8-foot chain link fence now, but when I was a student here the rooms had glass walls and doors that led to the outside of the building. Those windows were covered over with stone now because who wants kids distracted by blue skies and green grass? I know it's all designed to keep children safe. The walls went up because bullets can go through windows. The fence went up because predators could grab kids off the playground and drive off. We create traps and jails for ourselves to protect us from the evil on the street, surrendering our freedom to the criminal element. We move further and further away from the source of the crimes, tearing down nature, paving it over in cookie-cutter subdivisions, and crime follows us out into the suburbs, seeking to escape the same nameless terror. It is because we do not punish properly. There are entire cottage industries that have cropped up around defending criminals. It's not PC to say something to the effect, if you do the crime, you surrender your rights. The PB Police Department keeps the public defender necessary. It's easy to find abuse cases all across the country where police have framed the innocent, railroaded small crimes into major penalties and ran roughshod over the Constitution. The problem is in both cases, we allow it to happen. I don't know that there is an easy solution to end criminality. I think a solution to lower criminality is to increase literacy and create opportunity through education, and not necessarily the K-12 education system that trains up corporate drones. If you increase literacy rates among a population, you can increase the opportunities they can expect. Most people don't know about the world that exists outside of their small sphere in town. They watch the news, which is filled with horrors, and think that's how the world operates.